Today's program, featuring Georgetown University professor Michael Kazin, is part of an ongoing series of these events sponsored by Chevy Chase at Home. As you may know, this organization engages our community in social and educational programming, both in person and virtually. We also provide volunteer services to older adults who need assistance, including rides, errands, tech support, and a variety of other services. We are very pleased to have Professor Kazin with us today in the midst of this tumultuous election season, because he is one of the leading historians of the American political system. He has had a distinguished career, and I encourage you to Google him and get the whole story. His talk today will be drawn from his recent book, What It Took to Win: A History of the Democratic Party. The book was an editor's choice of the New York Times and was named by Kirkus to be one of the 10 best books on U.S. history published in 2022. Professor Kazin will make a presentation and he will take your questions afterward. You can write your question at any time during his talk in the Zoom chat area, or you may raise your hand and I'll try to find you and recognize you. Again, welcome, Professor Kazin. We're so excited to have you with us today. Please proceed.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you, Jennifer, and everybody else who's organized this event for this hour here we have together. I'm a former resident of Chevy Chase myself, but I've moved south to DC about 8 years ago. So, but it's good to be connected with Chevy Chase again in this way. What I want to do for the next half hour, 40 minutes or so, is to give you a rather brief stroll, I hope a interesting one, through the history of the Democratic Party over the past century. What I want to try to do is to explain how the Democrats became the majority party in the United States in the middle decades of the last century, and then have struggled to regain that status over the last 50 years or so. And in the question period, I'm quite happy to talk about the history of the party as well as what's with a little less than 3 weeks before the election on November 5th. One of the reasons I like being historian of politics is because politics is always with us, past, present, and future. So let me start with a picture of a presidential candidate many of you may not have heard of. I want to ask, I can't see you, so I can't ask you to raise your hands, but I wonder how many of you have heard of John W. Davis. John W. Davis, exactly 100 years ago, was the Democratic Party's nominee for president of the United States. He was rather, little known actually before he got the nomination in 1924. He was a compromise choice after an exhausted Democratic convention in Madison Square Garden in New York had gone for 2 weeks and 103 ballots to try to find a candidate. Back then, as you probably know, candidates in both parties were decided at the convention. They were not decided by primaries. They were decided by delegates chosen by party bosses in their states, in the regions. Primaries had nothing to do with it. Or primaries, there were a few primaries back then, but they were just advisory. Very few delegates were chosen in those primaries. 1924, the Democratic Party was badly split. It was split between its base in the White South, the Solid South, as it used to be called, former states in the Confederacy, in most cases, and a northern constituency made up mostly of white working class voters, made them Catholic and Jewish. And one of the big debates in the 1924 convention in Madison Square Garden was whether to denounce the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, or not. KKK back in the 1920s was not just anti-Black, it was also anti-Jewish and anti-Catholic. And the Northern Democrats, of course, abhorred the Klan, especially the Catholic and Jewish among them. And the Southern Democrats Even if they didn't like the Klan privately, they felt they could not denounce it publicly because there's so much support for the Klan among the constituents in the South. Well, Davis ran for president. It was a three-way race in 1924. Republicans ran Calvin Coolidge, who was the incumbent, and there was a Progressive Party campaign run by a guy named Robert La Follette, a popular senator from Wisconsin. John W. Davis got all of 28.8% of the popular vote in 1924, the lowest percentage any Democrat has ever gotten for president in American history. So that was a historical nadir, historical low point for the Democrats. But Democrats had something going for them, besides the fact they had a base in the white South. In my book, What It Took to Win, right here, I argue that one of the things that Democrats have done when they've been successful, one of the ways they've been successful is by expressing a politics of what I call moral capitalism and policies to match. And I argue that moral capitalism for Democrats has had two different sides to it. One was depicted by this rather ferocious graphic. One was anti-monopoly, the idea that big corporations, big banks had too much power over the economy, too much power over the ordinary person, whether the ordinary person was a farmer, a small business person, or a wage earner. And so from the 19th century, really from Andrew Jackson's presidency onward into the 20th century, Democrats were known as the party against monopoly, against concentrated power in the economy, against bigness in the economy, for the little person, for the small owner of property, the small farmer, and the wage earner. Up until, as you'll see, till the late 1930s, this appeal was almost entirely only to white Americans. Democrats were, after all, the party that had defended slavery, a party that split before the Civil War between anti-slavery and post-slavery factions. But Democrats in the 19th century did not support civil rights, did not support equal justice under law for all races, and did not even support the rights for Black men to vote under the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. But anti-monopoly was one thing which united all Democrats, as I said, almost all white Democrats in this case, against the concentrated power of big capital. Another side of moral capitalism that Democrats stood for and that often brought them success was support for wage earners. American economy, as it progressed from being a predominantly agricultural economy to being a overwhelmingly industrial economy, most Americans were no longer able to be farmers owning their own property or craftspeople, or the families of those people who were making a shoe or a garment with their own labor without much machinery. Most Americans were working for somebody else, usually for a middle-sized or large business by the late 19th, early 20th century. And William Jennings Bryan, who ran for president 3 times as a Democrat, was never elected. But you see in this cartoon, he was someone who argued that the Democrats are the party that wants to free the worker to vote for anybody they want to, wants to free the worker to be able to join unions, to be able to boycott anti-union companies, to be able to have their labor unions protected by the government when they're able to organize those unions, whereas Republicans who were here in this cartoon are symbolized by Mark Hanna, who was the campaign manager for William McKinley, 1896, and also for 1900, want to put a crown of thorns of coercion over the heads of workers, and basically tell the workers, if you don't vote for the Republicans, you might lose your job. If you don't vote for the Republicans, the company might move away to a more corporate-friendly, business-friendly area. And this support for organized labor is something Democrats began doing in a major way at the turn of the 20th century, and continue, as we'll see, that the support for organized labor continues to be a really important staple of Democratic Party politics, both in terms of what they say to people, their rhetoric, and also their programs. into the 20th century, and I think today as well. Well, even though Davis lost so badly, the backbone of his support, and this is not much known really, even people don't know much about the history of the party, was supported very strongly by a women's network, a network of female reformers, some from working class backgrounds, some not. The most famous of whom was this woman, Eleanor Roosevelt, who before she became First Lady of the United States, when her husband Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected in 1932, she was one of the main figures in a network of female reformers, of settlement house workers, of labor reformers, of suffragists, who believed that the government should be used to benefit the average person in various ways, including the average woman.
The caption is not working. I tried to.
And she was active in forming a group called the Women's National Democratic Club in Washington, D.C., which is still here, right next to DuPont Circle on New Hampshire Avenue. Their building is. In many ways, she and other women reformers like Frances Perkins, a New Yorker who became the first woman in the cabinet when she was Secretary of Labor, when Franklin D. Roosevelt took power, this Women's Network put forth a vision of the party supporting what we consider today more of a welfare state, one that benefited men as well as women, women as well as men, that benefited children as well, that had aid to families with dependent children, that had support for labor unions organizing, that abolished child labor, various other reforms to help working Americans. So even though the Democrats were in the doldrums electorally in the 1920s, some of the, what should I say, the elements of recovery for the Democrats, the elements of Democrats being able to get back in power again were there, even in the 1920s, even at the low point of their electoral fortunes. Well, the Great Depression then happens, and as I'm sure you know, that's when the Democrats begin their heyday, not just in the 20th century, but through all American history. From 1930, when the Democrats take back one house of Congress, until the late 1960s, Democrats are the majority party in the country, not just in the South, where they'd always been the majority party, but in most northern states as well. Excuse me. And part of the reason they're able to do this is not just because they, in rhetoric and program, are espousing ideas which will help the ordinary working person, but also because they're backed up by a social movement. Often when you think about politics and you read newspapers and websites about what each party's saying, which candidates, what all the candidates are saying, their consultants are coming up with very ingenious ads to denounce the other party and support their party. We often are under the delusion, I think, of believing that the messaging from on top, the leaders on top, decide whether or not the party is going to win or not. And that somehow voters are just sort of empty vessels, absorbing, listening to, and ingesting these messages. Well, that's not really how politics works in a democratic country like ours. Politics is a matter of winning over constituencies by working with people who are very influential in those constituencies. And that was true when the Black Freedom Movement rose in the 1950s and 60s, when the Democratic Party became part of that, supportive of that movement in various ways. And it was especially true in the 1930s when Democrats aligned with the organized labor movement. And the organized labor movement was growing in a way in the 1930s and early 1940s it had never grown before. There were 3 million union members in America in 1933 at the pit of the Great Depression, when over 25% of Americans were unemployed. By 1945, the end of World War II, there were 15 million union members in the country. And one of the drivers of this increase, not the only one, but one of them, was a new labor federation that grew out of the existing federation. The new labor federation was called the Congress of Industrial Organization, or the CIO. And it was a CIO that organized some of the basic workers in some of the basic industries in America: the auto industry, electrical products industry, meatpacking industry, longshore industry on the West Coast. And the steel industry. And here's a picture of four middle-aged steel workers from a town in Western Pennsylvania, where steel is still made, though not as much as it used to be, who are obviously white. They're probably from Slavic backgrounds. They might be Polish, they might be Slovenian, they might be Serbian. But Western Pennsylvania was an area where a lot of Eastern Europeans had migrated, and a lot of these guys are probably from one of those Slavic groups. And the CIO had a larger message for people, which is that men and women both, because there were women in CIO unions as well, are the basis of a good society. And Democratic leaders did not say explicitly, we want you to join a union, which actually Joe Biden has said in his administration, but they did pass legislation to make it easier to join a union, a famous act called the Wagner Act, which set up the National Labor Relations Board, which is still with us today, which, as you might know, if in a given bargaining unit, workers in that bargaining unit, a majority of them sign cards saying they want to have an election, then the National Labor Relations Board holds that election. And before 1935, when the National Labor Act was passed, setting up the National Labor Relations Board, there was no guarantee that if a majority of workers wanted to join a union, that they'd be able to. There was no democratic procedure in place for that to happen. 1935, Wagner Act set that up. Robert Wagner was a senator from New York, a very liberal senator from New York. And something else very important about the CIO, it was interracial. Its unions were interracial by principle. Practically, those who started the CIO believed that it was crazy to try to form unions that were segregated because Black workers would just be used as strike breakers to break the strikes of these unions. But also, a lot of the people who formed the CIO, the major unions of the CIO, like the auto workers, like the steel workers, like some of the other unions, were radicals of one kind or another. Some were members of the Socialist Party, some were members of the Communist Party. Even when they weren't, they believed very strongly in an interracial society. And the very fact that the CIO, together with the rest of the labor movement, became a pillar of the Democratic Party, thanks to the Democratic Party supporting some of their major aims, not just make it easier to organize unions, but also a minimum wage, which Congress passed in 1938 under the Wages and Hours Act, and also programs like this one, Social Security, giving people our age some security in our old age. Black people begin to support the Democratic Party for the first time. A majority of Black people vote for Democrats in American history. But before this, the Democratic Party, of course, had been, as I mentioned before, the party of the White South, the party of almost all Confederates had been Democrats before the Civil War, the party that still upheld the brutal order of Jim Crow in the South, of segregation. So the very fact the union movement was an interracial movement, was including people of all races, and that was one of the things, along with some of the welfare programs, the job creating programs of the New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt's administration, helped to convince African Americans to vote for Democrats for the first time instead of to vote for Republicans. And for the last 90 years, Democrats, as you probably know, have been a pillar of the Democratic Party. Before that, they never were. And the unions were an important part of that. Now, here's the TVA, which was a government-built infrastructure program, which brought electricity to the Deep South, and is still around today, and helps to subsidize electricity that people pay in many southern states today. But the Democratic Party was still, at this time, a party which needed support from the White South to win elections. It was a party in transition from its racist past to its anti-racist future. And one example of that is the congressman who was the main writer of the TVA bill, which passed Congress in the mid-1930s, was this guy, John Rankin from Mississippi, who on the floor of Congress gave explicitly anti-Semitic and anti-Black speeches. And you see a little bit of that in the quotations below. He was from Mississippi. He was completely opposed to Black people voting, completely opposed to Black people segregating any institution in American society. But as a congressman who had to get elected and get reelected in Democratic primaries in Mississippi, he had to support programs like the TVA, which were helping his constituents, who were mostly poor, white, and working class people. This begins to change. The complexion, if you will, of the Democratic Party begins to change in the 1930s. And in the 1940s, it really makes a huge change. Democrats, by the late 40s, no longer are a party supporting racism and segregation, at least nationally. One of the drivers of this is the first Black congressman from Harlem, New York City, a overwhelmingly Black neighborhood, Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who was elected and reelected for 26 years, 13 straight terms. Here he is in the center with some of his constituents in Harlem. And one of the things that Powell did in Congress was he attached to every domestic bill he could what was called the Powell Amendment, which refused funds for any federal project going to any institution in America that was segregated by race. Now, the Powell Amendment was not included in most of these bills, in fact, hardly any of them, until the 1960s. But this was a sign that the Democratic Party, one of the leaders of the Democratic Party, was a Black man from Harlem, who was actually in the 60s the chair of the Education and Labor Committee, one of the main committees in Congress, in the House of Representatives. And it was clear that he was going to make a statement here that federal money should not go to racial institutions, racist institutions, I should say. And by the 60s, Democrats support the Civil Rights Act, propose the Civil Rights Act and get it passed, the Voting Rights Act, 1965 as well, which for the first time, you can argue, makes America a true democracy. Because until 1965, most African Americans in the South, where most African Americans still live, could not actually vote. They're prohibited from voting via all various kinds of nefarious means, even though they had the right to vote constitutionally, based on the 15th Amendment for Black men and based on the 19th Amendment for all women as well. But Democrats had made a decision by the late 40s that they were no longer going to support segregation officially. And the man who gave a famous speech at the 1948 Democratic Convention in Minneapolis, I forget where it was. Minneapolis, was the mayor of Minneapolis, Hubert Humphrey on the left. He as an older man, arguing that the Democratic Party had to put his past behind it and march to the sunshine of human rights, as he put it. And here, and in 1964, when Humphrey was a senator, very powerful senator from Minnesota, he was the main driver in the Senate of the Civil Rights Bill. And here, of course, after the Civil Rights Bill is passed, after Lyndon Johnson wins a landslide re-election in 1964 with Hubert Humphrey as his vice president, Johnson thanked Humphrey for his help getting the Civil Rights Bill passed by getting him to run with him on the ticket in 1964. Here he is, of course, thanking Martin Luther King Jr. and his wife, Coretta Scott King, for this partnership between this part of the Black freedom movement and the Democratic Party, led by liberals, like at the time by Hubert Humphrey from the North, of course, and not from the South. Well, this is the heyday of the Democratic Party in American politics. It's a party of labor, white and Black and Hispanic. It's a party of civil rights. It's a party which wins one of the largest landslides in American electoral history, 1964. Seemed like everything's going well for the Democrats. But actually, soon after that, the Democrats begin to go into crisis. Some of you were alive to experience that crisis, so I perhaps don't have to underline it as much as I would for my students who are, 50 years younger than I am, if not more. 1972, Democrats run a campaign which is one of the most progressive campaigns in American history. They support abortion rights. They support, for the first time any political party has done this, they support gay and lesbian rights, as they were then known, now LGBT rights. They are a multicultural party. This is the first time in American electoral history in which both parties choose their candidates based on primaries, not just on party bosses choosing the delegates, which is a reform that takes place after the 1968 Democratic Convention, which was a convention full of chaos and riots by police and to some degree by demonstrators, which Democrats never wanted to repeat. And so they decided after the 68 convention, they would reform their procedure to have delegates chosen for that convention, and primaries would choose them rather than party bosses choosing those delegates. Well, the nominee was actually a man who was in charge of the commission that proposed those reforms was George McGovern, senator from South Dakota. But he had some problems. Abortion rights was not yet as popular as it became after Roe v. Wade and the years after that. He was opposed to the war in Vietnam, which a lot of Americans were at the time. The war had gone on for a very long time. The U.S. had been involved in fighting it for 7 years by 1972. However, he wanted to just get out of Vietnam. He was happy to have the other side win, it seemed. The other side, of course, led by communists. And so this was unpopular as well, his solution. So he was just seen as too radical for a lot of Americans. And he lost in a landslide to Richard Nixon, winning re-election. Some of you might remember the Watergate scandal, which broke out a year after the election, and then 2 years after the Democratic Convention of 1972, Richard Nixon had to resign from the presidency, or else he would have been impeached and convicted and thrown out of office by Congress. Some people used to have bumper stickers on their cars after Nixon resigned, saying, "Don't blame me, I'm from Massachusetts," because Massachusetts was the one state in the Union, besides DC, not a state, which voted for McGovern as opposed to voting for Richard Nixon. But the Democrats had a problem. They were now the party of what historians call the new social movements, of African Americans, of Chicanos or Mexican American leftists, of gay and lesbians, of feminists, but that was not a majority. And many Americans, including many working class Americans, were still uncomfortable with a lot of these movements, if not openly hostile to them. So the Democrats were taking on an image more and more as cultural rebels, cultural liberals, at least as supportive of people who thought quite differently from the majority of Americans in many cultural ways. They still had the support of most of the labor movement, even though in 1972, the labor movement for the first time in decades, now the AFL-CIO was the leading federation of American unions by 1972. For the first time, the AFL-CIO does not support a presidential candidate, in breaking with this long tradition of always supporting Democrats. Why? Because the leaders of the AFL-CIO, led by George Meany, who was the president, a conservative plumber from the Bronx, New York, felt that McGovern's stand on the war was too radical, that he was in favor of a communist victory, and labor leaders, like a lot of working class Americans, were unhappy with how the war was going, but they still wanted to support the troops, and supporting the troops meant for them continuing the war long enough so that Americans could get out with honor. And they perceived as McGovern as opposed to that. Well, Democrats have a problem then. They lose the election of 72. They win the election of 1976 narrowly with Jimmy Carter, partly because Jimmy Carter is a white Southerner, the first Southerner since before the Civil War to win election in his own right. Lyndon Johnson, of course, was from Texas, but he became president when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And then, of course, he won in his own right in 1964. So Carter was the exception since the 70s. After that, Democrats lose the next 3 presidential elections, 1980, 1984, 1988. And they narrowly win in 1992 with Bill Clinton when there were 3 major candidates that year. Ross Perot, you remember him running an independent campaign as well. Here's Clinton on the left. Now, one of the things that Clinton did was he did move the party to the center. He did talk much less about supporting labor, much more about wanting to support business and growing businesses in America. He was the major mover behind NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which actually majority of Democrats opposed because the labor movement opposed it, but it was passed with Republican votes more than Democratic votes. Excuse me, but the Democrats still wanted to keep this coalition of cultural movements, sort of minority cultural movements on their side, because they realized they couldn't become a majority party again unless they were able to keep a broad coalition together. In a two-party system, the one we have, every party is a broad coalition if it's going to be successful. If it's a narrow coalition of only one constituency or one group or one race or one ethnic group or one class, it's not going to be the governing party in America. So on the right here, you see a demonstration by gay men demonstrating for equal rights for gay people at the 1976 Democratic Convention, continuing the support that Democrats did give to the gay and lesbian rights movement. But Clinton was head of a group called the Democratic Leadership Council, which brought together a lot of Southern Democrats who were still Democrats, who didn't want Republicans to take over the South completely, even though Republicans were winning a lot of Southern votes in presidential elections. But they thought the way to do that was to understate their support for things like gay rights as much as possible, not talk much about affirmative action, not talk about special programs for African Americans, talk more about programs that would help most Americans, and especially that would keep the economy stable. And here on the left is President Bill Clinton with, of course, First Lady Hillary Clinton at the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial, which was established during Clinton's presidency in the 1990s. Well, go to the present now. One of the things that kept happening for Democrats, and there's been a lot of discussion about this in the media, and I'm sure you've noted it, is the party that used to be the party of working class people of all races in the 30s and the 40s, into the 1960s, really, even into the early 1970s, is no longer the party which most working class people support, especially no longer most white working class people support. And one interesting way to see this diminution of Democratic Party support among working class people is to look at what's happened to Democrats in the state of West Virginia. Just a few, 100 miles or so away from us here in the DC area. West Virginia, from the 1930s on, was one of the most Democratic states in the Union. And part of the reason it was so is because it was a Union state, and the main union in West Virginia was the United Mine Workers of America, an older union, but one that organized pretty much every miner in West Virginia by the 1930s and 1940s. And the head of that union was the guy on the left, John Llewellyn Lewis, very charismatic and rather authoritarian leader of that union. The United Mine Workers had, with federal help from Democratic presidents like Harry Truman, and later on John Kennedy, had set up a healthcare plan covering every miner and their families in West Virginia at very low cost. And the union also taught its members and family members of its members, Democratic Party was the party of Social Security, the party of Medicare and Medicaid, the party that supported union rights, party that looked out for the average person. And when the United Mine Workers was strong in West Virginia, most West Virginians voted overwhelmingly for Democrats. Even as late as the late 1980s, when Democrats lost the presidential election, when Michael Dukakis, then the governor of Massachusetts, was a Democratic candidate, not perceived as a sort of working class hero in any way. One of the first states on election night to be called for Democrats was West Virginia, even though Dukakis lost the presidency to George H.W. Bush in 1988 by 8 percentage points in the popular vote and many electoral votes as well. And here's a picture of miners, some of the members of the union. Well, by 2016 and 2020, and this year as well, West Virginia was one of the most Republican states in the country. And here's a certain presidential candidate in 2016 saying, if you remember, Trump digs coal, remember that? Wearing a little awkwardly a hard hat. which actually coal miners, don't wear hard hats like that. That's more steel workers and construction workers. But nevertheless, he got votes from former coal miners, of whom there are a bunch in West Virginia still, but West Virginia is no longer much of a coal mining state. West Virginia is no longer much of a industrial state. Really, it makes it on tourism a lot, and on Social Security benefits going to retired people, some of whom are coal miners. Mostly, a lot of young people have left the state because they can't find good jobs there. So the irony is the Democratic Party used to be the party of poor and working class Americans primarily. The Republican Party was more the party of the middle class and wealthier Americans in West Virginia and other states like it, other West Belt states like Ohio, like Indiana, like Kentucky, have become really part of the Republican Party base because they've won over working class people. Not just because unions have declined in the private sector, which they have, but also because of cultural issues like some of the ones I mentioned before, which still are a problem for Democrats among white working class people, especially, and some more white working class people of different races as well. Well, let me finish up with talking about the Democratic Party today. You've heard of these guys. Two active socialists, I should say not active socialists, two acknowledged socialists, proud socialists, Democratic Party. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on the left, Congresswoman from New York City, and Bernie Sanders on the right, Senator from Vermont. There are two possible futures I can see for the Democratic Party, and we'll have to see what happens in this election, of course. One is to move further to the left, further in a progressive direction. The Progressive Coalition in Congress now has over 100 members, all of whom are in the House of Representatives, except one, Bernie Sanders, senator from Vermont, the only senator in the Progressive Caucus. And there's a lot of support in the Democratic Party on the left and among its voters for programs like national health care, child care for everybody, higher taxes on the rich, and a Green New Deal. But Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are running on a moderate platform, even though they are obviously hoping to, in fact, banking on getting the votes of progressives. And so far, they clearly have a united coalition with some cracks in it, some tensions in it. Not so much about domestic policy right now, but about the war in Gaza and Israel's war in Lebanon as well. But Harris and Walz clearly want to be more business friendly than the progressive coalition would like to be. They are making appeals to the wealthy in Silicon Valley and elsewhere. And so they're in favor of more of a Big Tent party, which one can argue will not address some of the problems that the progressive coalition folks and people like Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders would like to address. So I wouldn't say the Democratic Party is going to split wide open if Harris and Walz lose. Obviously, if they win, it will remain together, at least for a while, behind their leadership. But there is a problem that Democratic Party has some important disagreements within it. But again, to reiterate my point before, in order to win in American politics, you need to be a broad coalition. You need to find ways of, if not resolving those differences, convincing the different sides in that coalition to agree to disagree, and yet stay in the party and push for programs that they all agree on. Democrats were able to do that to a degree in the last 4 years, even in the last 2 years when they did not have a majority in the House of Representatives. And the question will be going forward if they can do it again. And this is just I've gone on for about 40 minutes, but it's obviously just a brief summary of what I talk about in this book. And if you'd like to read more about it, I'm sure you can figure out how to find it. So thank you, and I hope there are some questions or comments or disagreements.
Thanks very much, Professor Kazin. Very fascinating and wide-ranging. Lots of information for us. Lots of great understanding of history. I want to just remind everyone, if you have a question, you can put it in the chat, the Zoom chat, and I will ask it to Professor Kazin. or if you want to raise your hand, I'll call on you. You can unmute your mic and ask your question. Why don't I get started while people formulate their questions? I just have a question. Um, as the Democrats try to build a winning coalition, how do they regain the support of the working people in America that have so many of whom have gone
Sure.
to the Republicans and Donald Trump specifically?
Sure. Well, I think it's how they've done it in the past. Obviously not exactly the same way, but as I said before, I outlined in the book the idea of something I call moral capitalism. A term I didn't invent. I got it from a friend of mine who wrote a great book on the New Deal, Elizabeth Cohen. But that is, to put it bluntly, give people things they want and need. Social Security did that. The Works Progress Administration did that during the 1930s, giving people jobs. Medicare did that. Medicare does that. A child care allowance would do that. And the TVA did that, electrical power. Capitalism, I think, is a unequal system by its nature, but it's a system that's been responsible for tremendous growth. But for it to be a system to be more equitable and fairer, or you might say more moral, it needs to be regulated. Governments in capitalist countries like ours, I think, need to be pushed to, enact programs that will help the ordinary person deal with some of the inevitable abuses of a capitalist economy, and just the unfairness of life in general. So how can they do that now? Well, Joe Biden has tried to some degree passing, at least having Congress pass this ambitious Inflation Reduction Act, which is not primarily about inflation. It's about infrastructure projects, which will be worked on by union labor, which are starting up all around the country. It's about trying to make it easier to join unions again. There's a bill called the PRO Act, which would penalize employers who don't negotiate with unions once a union vote has been once the majority of workers in a given bargaining unit, given workplace, have said they want to join a union. Under the current law, the employers can take a long time, if ever, to actually negotiate with that union. Well, the PRO Act would penalize them monetarily, rather steep ways, for not negotiating with the union. Also, I think the minimum wage should be increased. The minimum wage now nationally is about $7.25 an hour, which is ridiculous. Nobody can really live on that much. Many states have increased it, but some states have not. Even so, it should be a national standard of at least $15 an hour, if not more. Kamala Harris has talked about making it easier for people to buy houses. So a raft of programs like that, but it's more than that. Democrats also, I think, have to make it clear that their appeal is not to minorities, which might be oppressed, though they want to appeal to them as well, but to all Americans, especially all working Americans. They need to define their programs as universal programs, like Social Security, like Medicare, which can help a lot of people, even people who don't necessarily need them. I mean, I earn a very good income at Georgetown University. I'm not retired yet, but I still get Social Security. I get a lot of money from Social Security every month. It's not a progressive program, but why is Social Security so popular? Because everybody gets it. It's universal when you get to a certain age. So I think if Democrats did that, and they also, stopped appearing as if they were opposed to people who, for example, believe in, owning guns for hunting, stop arguing that people are racist, who oppose affirmative action. Some are, certainly, but a lot of people oppose affirmative action because they believe that it's unfair to people who work very hard, who aren't, who are from working class backgrounds themselves, but because of their race are not able to get some of the positions that African Americans can get. So in various ways, these are just some examples, I think, of how Democrats can appeal more working class people. And of course, they have to run candidates who are appealing to those folks. Kamala Harris is still winning the election, and I'm very much for her, not surprisingly. But she is a San Francisco liberal, and those two terms, where you're from, San Francisco, and liberal, are coded as culturally elitist, and that's a problem. Tim Walz less so, of course. And also, I think it's important for Democrats to run candidates who can appeal to people based on their life experience as well as their programs and their rhetoric. So that's the beginning. And look, I'm not a strategist. I'm just a historian. But those are my my own opinions about this.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the Obama coalition and what made his election and re-election possible.
Sure.
And whether why did that go away for the Democrats?
First of all, I got to say hello to my old friend Nate Billig. Hi, Nate. Well, first of all, remember the Great Recession? Well, it began in 2008, and until Lehman Brothers failed, until the stock market went down, until the housing market collapsed, John McCain had as good a chance of being elected as Barack Obama did. In fact, he was leading in some of the polls until late summer, early fall of 2008. And then, Obama won, but then any Democrat would have won. Hillary Clinton, who almost got the nomination in 2008, as you remember, would have won as well. At the same time, Obama did build a coalition of people who believe very strongly that some kind of sort of basic change was necessary in American society. His campaign had the ethos of a movement, even though a campaign is not a movement. Labor is a movement, the Black freedom movement was a movement, the feminist movement was a movement, the conservative movement is a movement, but they aren't parties. But he did infuse the party at the time with the ethos, the spirit of a movement. I remember I was in Arlington, I think, or Alexandria in 2008, and you had to get online to be able to get into the office, the Obama office, to make phone calls to voters. There's some people who want to do it. Now, of course, just people do it from their homes. But at the same time, Obama also raised expectations beyond what he could deliver. The recession continued, of course, in the first year of his administration. The Tea Party arose to oppose him. The Obamacare rollout was a mess, as you know. Then Occupy Wall Street began in 2011. A bunch of radicals around the country who didn't last as a movement, but did put the idea of income inequality, 99% versus the 1% out there, into public discourse. And Obama was ambivalent about a lot of this. Some Democrats supported it, some didn't. But by 2012, Obama won because he was the incumbent and because Romney was depicted as, a rich guy who'd made money, by private equity, which is not, actually directly producing things. But by 2012, the Obama coalition was already unraveling. And by 2012 also, even though he was running against a billionaire, and Obama, of course, was someone from a more modest background and was African-American to boot, the white working class vote in the country went pretty decidedly against Obama in 2012, even though he was able to win the states in the Rust Belt. He was able, however, to win the union vote, which was very decisive in winning those states at the time. And then Trump wins, and Trump is a popular figure, I think, partly because he speaks people's fears. He speaks people's fears about immigrants, about losing jobs, about America never being great again, as well as being a performer, pretty good performer, unfortunately, from my point of view. And I think people who don't have a lot of faith in the system, don't have a lot of faith in politicians generally because they feel they've lost out economically. And for the last 50 years, white working class people have actually lost out. Their incomes, which when you include inflation over the last 50 years, have actually not gone up. The only group in American society whose incomes have not gone up are white working class people. because so many of them worked in manufacturing, so many of them worked in mining and other industries who have suffered over the last 50 years. And the unions also have declined, obviously. Excuse me. So that's what happened to the Obama coalition. It still exists in some ways, but it basically, even when Obama was in power, it was already unraveling.
We have another question. Can you briefly talk about the future of democracy in this country?
Democracy as opposed to the Democratic Party, per se.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, of course, it's scary to have a president who said that he won an election, he clearly lost. It's scary to have a Supreme Court majority saying that the president can do anything he wants, pretty much, if it's considered a presidential act instead of the act of a private citizen. These are scary. It's scary to have people around the country who are supporting Trump. A majority of those who are going to vote for Trump think the 2020 election was stolen, and this should be his third term, which of course is not constitutional. Since the 22nd Amendment was passed, you can't have more than 2 terms. At the same time, I'm let's say hopeful, if not a little optimistic, that no matter who wins the election, I think most Americans, whatever they might say to pollsters about elections being stolen, whatever, would not be happy about elections being canceled. We're not happy about voters who are eligible voters not being allowed to cast a vote. Would not be happy if the Supreme Court somehow agreed to a diminishing of democratic rights. Would not be supportive of severe restrictions on free speech. So I'm at least cautiously optimistic that the basic institutions and laws in America that do uphold democracy will survive. So far, Donald Trump is trying to win an election. He is saying once in a while that if he wins again, he will punish his enemies. But some of that is because his crowds cheer that. Whether he could do that or not, in an election that he would win, if he wins, it'll be very narrowly, as you know. Same for Kamala Harris. If you have almost half the country against you to do some of the things that you've said you want to do, it's not going to be easy for him to do those things. So even though I, am in no way favorable to his programs or his rhetoric, same time, how much of that he'll be able to carry out if he wins is, I think, very much an open question.
You mentioned earlier that you see Harris and Walz as a more centrist Democrats. I wonder what you think. Well, one of our audience members asks, how do you think they will govern? Will they be more centrist or more conservative, or will
as everything else,
depends
what they can do. How you govern depends what you want to do and what you can do. What they want to do will be to pass some of the programs we're talking about, child care allowances, continue the green infrastructure projects, of course. But they will try to crack down more on undocumented migrants, certainly, because that's obviously very popular. They will try to support unions, but they can only do so much as president. And what they can do depends on majorities in Congress and, of course, having the courts on their side. They won't have the Supreme Court on their side unless a couple of people on the court now retire or die, and also the federal courts below them as well, which is still pretty split between Democratic appointees and Republican appointees. It depends on the court, and also depends on if they have majorities in both houses of Congress. Right now, most people believe or predict that Democrats will lose control of the Senate, if only narrowly. And if Harris wins the presidency, they have a pretty good chance of having control of the House, but only narrowly as well. So every time when far-reaching legislation was passed by either party, Republicans or Democrats in America, it's only happened when that party not just has the presidency, but also has control by a pretty significant margin of both houses of Congress. And it's unlikely that will happen in 2025. So that struggle will go on.
One last question. We're almost out of time, but
Sure.
let me ask you, I know you're a historian of the Democratic Party, but the Republican Party also has been has quite a split now with people like Liz Cheney and others talking about creating another party. Is there a future for a three-party system in the United States? Could Republicans ever win if they uh, factions went their own ways?
Great question. Well, first of all, I think the Republican Party is not as split as the Democratic Party. I wouldn't say the Democratic Party is very split right now, except over an issue like the war in Gaza. But all Democrats pretty much are supportive of the candidacy of Harris and Walz, whereas a lot of Republicans obviously are not supporting Trump, but. Vance, but the difference is that the Republicans are supporting Trump and Vance have very little power. They're not part of a anti-Trump coalition in Congress. Liz Cheney lost her race for Congress last time by 30 points in the primary in Wyoming. So this is Trump's party. Even more than the Democratic Party is Harris's party. And even more than it was Biden's party before he dropped out of the race. So the chance of a third party, the history of third parties in America was nicely summed up by the great historian Richard Hofstadter. Having read his work, you should. He died many years ago, but his work is still worth reading. And he said third parties in America are like honeybees. They sting and then they die. What he meant by third parties can have a really important impact in one race, hardly ever two. The People's Party had a big impact in Congress, congressional races, and presidential race in the early 1890s, and then it pretty much died. Ross Perot had an important impact in 1992 when he ran against NAFTA, got a lot of people to oppose free trade, and then he ran in 96 again, and then he fell out of politics and so forth. Third parties in America are very difficult to organize in a durable way. They're protest parties. There's no example of a third party in American history, which been much more than that in American history. No third party has gotten more than 10% of the vote in two straight presidential elections. We've had three progressive parties in American history: 1924, 1948, I'm sorry, 1912, 1924, and 1948, and neither of them lasted, much beyond that election. And each of them rose because they nominated a popular figure in America: Teddy Roosevelt, Robert La Follette, Henry Wallace, but neither of them had much future in politics after that. So I don't think that's going to happen. In other words, I think the Republicans are like Liz Cheney, like even now, I believe Karl Rove said he was going to support Harris, which is even more shocking than Liz Cheney in many ways. But I think what they'll likely do, if they hope Donald Trump loses, they will then fight for control of the Republican Party, because they'll hope that after a 78-year-old candidate runs his third race for president and loses 2 out of the 3 races, that then his brand in the party will decline drastically, and then they will be able to come back. I think that's doubtful for various reasons, but because Trump took over the party, William Jennings Bryan ran 3 straight races for president, lost all 3 of them, but he transformed the Democratic Party to be much more of a pro-labor party, for example. And so it's going to be a while, I think, before the Republican Party is no longer Trump's party, even if Trump loses.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Kazin, for a very interesting and thought-provoking conversation.
I really enjoyed it, and if anybody has questions to ask me outside of this, I'm happy to answer emails. My email is michael.kazin@georgetown.edu. Very easy to remember. Michael, Michael.Kazin, Kazin @georgetown.edu.
Thanks again to Professor Kazin and to all of you for being a great audience. Enjoy the rest of your day.